Talking about sort of new technologies, what are your thoughts about the security levels in blockchain, for example? Because blockchain is becoming a more and more popular a way of dealing with big data. I mean, what are the security concerns you have with blockchain?
So, blockchain is fundamentally a way to have a distributed ledger where you can a group of people can agree that certain things happen in a certain particular order, and in those cases blockchain is a very useful approach, and there are ways to make it secure. Actually, blockchain is based on cryptographic concept that actually make it possible to have this blockchain, to have this ledger being certified. To me, the security problem is born when you don't have a centralized environment, and blockchain are decentralized by construction, and therefore you become somewhat vulnerable to selective denial of service attacks, where I can try to slow down certain operations to avoid certain people to be able to participate in a certain way. And there have been actual attacks of this kind, race condition, because it's a very distributed system. So a certain interleaving of actions could have let's say an unpredictable side effect. So these are the attacks that I've seen against blockchain type of technology, and especially in the case of cryptocurrencies. In the cryptocurrency world, in general, the problem becomes more of a policing problem. If you have a completely untraceable sort of way of do payments, this could look very good, but could also bring a lot of criminal activity that cannot be sort of blocked anymore, because we have been saying, let's follow the money to find the criminal, and suddenly somebody took that capability away from us, and then we cannot do anything about it.
Conventional centralized systems have well-known weaknesses. What advantages might a decentralized architecture have?
Absolutely. So centralized systems have been oftentimes looked at as problematic, because whenever you have a central system, then you could attack that system and take down a whole operation. Because of that, decentralized systems were introduced. And if you think about the internet was introduced by DARPA exactly for that reason. They want a network that would sustain, for example, entire cities being, annihilated in a nuclear warfare situation. So having packets being able to be rerouted in a decentralized way was the right way to characterize or to make a network functional in these cases. So in this centralized system, you have the advantage that you don't have a single point of failure. However, you have the disadvantage that if somebody controls enough of the nodes, it might decide certain particular property of the network. For example, they're called Byzantine attacks, where you control enough of the nodes of a network or the participants in a distributed transaction to actually create, for example, consensus over things that are not true. So decentralized is good, but could also be vulnerable to these attacks. So there are pros and cons. And in fact, if one think about authentication, Kerberos, which is a centralized way to authenticate users, is still used in a derivative form from Windows machines, because you want to have a centralized place where everybody is authenticated. But there are other situations in which you want that authentication to be distributed, to have a consensus between people. So if you're 8 people in a room and 6 people agree that I am Giovanni, suddenly I am authenticated. Well, unless you can brainwash those people, and then you can authenticate as whoever you want.
Given blockchain's decentralized nature, can you talk to us about decentralized storage and its advantages?
So, decentralization has several advantages, which is fundamentally the ability to sustain an attack to some of its part. Sometimes a blockchain, especially in the past few years, has been touted as a sort of a solution to a lot of problems. I think it's a solution to certain problems, but blockchaining everything is a mistake. It's a little bit of a fad because there are problems even in the way things are done. The proof of work, the fact that in order to verify certain transaction, you actually have to do a lot of CPU computation might not scale. The infrastructure might scale, but the proof of work that you have to do in doing a blockchain might require too much information. So imagine, for example, if all of a sudden all of us started using Bitcoin. That means that every single transaction in the world will go through a ledger and has to be verified. Now suddenly there's so many of these transactions or group of transactions in the blockchain, these blocks that have to be verified, that we would need so much CPU power that we might not be able to provide enough electricity for it. So blockchain is good for certain things. When you want to have a community that want to create consensus on a specific set of actions. But I would warn against using blockchain to solve every problem, because it's not the solution. It's one solution, it's one building block to building secure systems, but not the solution to everything.
And where are we with, in terms of traceability of attacks and stuff? Because they seem to be better at hiding themselves when people are hacking systems, they're sort of rerouting themselves halfway around the globe. Is that becoming more of a problem, or are we kind of getting to grips on that, do you think?
Tracing attacks, and not only tracing, but attributing attacks, saying this attack was carried out by this group versus this group, has always been incredibly difficult. Mostly because digital evidence is extremely malleable. It's not something physical that has molecules attached to that can leave an actual trace that is your DNA, for example. I can perform an attack and leave some evidence that I pretend I have carelessly left on the system that will direct attribution to a group of North Koreans or Russians or the Chinese groups. So it is very difficult with certainty to do that attribution. Usually you have a generic analysis of tool tactics and techniques. So things that are usually done by certain groups in a certain way that requires a lot of experience and a lot of observations. But after a while, you can see that certain groups tend to use certain type of technologies in a certain way. But this is, again, a little bit of a dark art because you have no real, in some cases you might have evidence, but it's very difficult to have hard evidence that something has been done in a certain way. So I would say that you can trace the attacks, you can say where they came from because you have logging, you can see where a connection came from, but understanding who's behind it is still very difficult to do.
Distributed denial of service attacks, they seem to be getting more and more common. Why do you think that is? Why do you think the hackers, etc.?
I think so. Distributed denial of service are just an attack that takes out a certain resource, a website or something. Usually this is done for political reasons because you want to take out a site that you do not agree with, or for ransom. I want to take out a site and say, hey, pay me X amount of, usually Bitcoins, or I will not stop taking you out. In general, they're short-lived, and if they're really a major problem, we have techniques to combat them. So I would say that they're common, but those are not the things that really worry me the most, because a denial of service is a nuisance, could be a big nuisance, but eventually you have way to identify what's wrong and how to block that type of traffic. Of course, we have seen, for example, for the Mirai botnet, that if you use a lot of devices, you can actually create a very large amount of traffic. But even in that case, eventually you are able to filter, the IPs and the addresses involved in the attack, and you can protect yourself. I think that's not our first concern, but it's a concern for a big company in which the time criticality is important. Think about traders and similar things.
I'm glad you mentioned the power requirements for Bitcoin, because let me say that just keeping one Bitcoin alive, shall we say, costs a huge amount of energy. So if you multiply that by tens of thousands, that's a huge amount of energy, isn't it?
Yeah.
I'm not sure how sustainable that is, really.
There are already cases in which the use of electricity has been spotted, and even the governments decided, to prohibit certain form of Bitcoin mining because it was too expensive and it was, putting too much stress on the electric grid.